Good evening and welcome to tonight's shiur. It's Thursday of Parshas Breishis, Shnas Hachil. I'd like to dedicate this shiur to the people who need refuah shlema, who are usually regular participants of the shiur, Reb Heschel Seif ben Rochel and Reb Yohu ben Sima. You should both see a refuah shlema speedily. Our first question here is that it was during this past Succos. Now, before I go into this whole list of Succos questions, you may be asking what's the value of learning about Succos now? And my son participated in a course for shluchim, and they were advised by one of the rabbonim that if you have a shaila, look it up. If you don't have an answer, do what you do. But then after Shabbos or Yom Tov, ask the question to someone who's qualified, so that next time it may come up again. So possibly these things will come up again, and so we'll know the halacha. So question number one, having lit Shabbos candles, so you've already been Mekabel Shabbos, and it's Chol HaMoed, and you realize, oops, I didn't bench Lulav this morning. Can you now go and bench Lulav? Or do you say once you've made it Lilo, once you've made it, accepted it, it's Nacht, so you can't go back and make it into day again? This is the question. So what we have here is two sources. One is on the lower left of the screen, a quote from the Aruch HaShulchan, Chaim quotes Aruch HaShulchan, where he says that if it's on Shmini Atzeres, it's already got into Bein Hashmoshes, it's after sunset, then you would not be allowed to take the Lulav, because the Lulav is muksa. So whilst you may want to say, oh, well, perhaps I can hop around and do Lulav, on the other hand, would be a violation of muksa. So he says, no, you don't take the Lulav. And this is the Aruch HaShulchan, and to this, the Chaim adds the same thing. Shabbos, Friday night during Succos would be the same problem. That it, because it's muksa, they wouldn't be allowed to pick it up. I just want to clarify something. That in muksa we have sometimes you are allowed to move something for a different like you're allowed to move a hammer to use it as a paperweight or to use it as keep as a door open, etc. That's called l'tzorech gufay mekoymai. So you're allowed, because you could improvise with a hammer, and therefore you are allowed to move it l'tzorech mekoymai. That doesn't work for the lulav, because you're not allowed to improvise with the lulav. There's nothing you're allowed to do with the lulav, and therefore the lulav is more muksa than a hammer. Again, Shabbos during Succos, the lulav and esrog is more muksa than a hammer. Screwdriver, etc. You wouldn't be allowed to move it. So having said that once it's already after sunset, you wouldn't be allowed to misofik, pick up the lulav and esrog. What we're now dealing with is, though, that you lit candles, or it could be a man who, for whatever reason, was Mekabel Yom Tov earlier on, and now wants to switch and say, no, well, perhaps it's still the day rather than night. So I've had a similar question. I've dealt with this in the past with someone who does a lot of mivtzoim, and one of the things which he likes to do, or does, is in this part of the world, a shiva house is a place from Zonish Darfen, Zonish Wissen, but a lot of people attend a shiva house. So he would go to shiva houses and chap the people there to put on tefillin with them. And someone turns to him, well, that man's just davened ma'ariv, and now you're putting on tefillin with him. I wonder whether the person did daven ma'ariv, he didn't put on tefillin, did he daven ma'ariv? But, I don't know these people so well, so it's possible. It could be he davened ma'ariv and hasn't put on tefillin. So can you put on tefillin after you've davened ma'ariv? So here we have on the screen, we've got here from the Alter Rebbe's, first from the Shulchan Aruch of the Rebbe Yosef Karo, and then from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. And this is in Simon Lamed. V'yesh mishu oimer, that if you've davened Ma'ariv early, and you haven't put on tefillin, ein lo lahanicha ma'achar kach. You shouldn't be putting on tefillin after you've davened Ma'ariv. This is the source of this psak, is from the Trumas Hadeshen, Rabbi Yisrael Isserlin. Just people like to hear a little bit of these biographical details. He wrote it's a Shalos at Shuvas, but he wrote the questions himself. He put together 354 questions and answers, the same gematria as the word deshen, and hence he gave the name Trumas Hadeshen. So he in his responsa, he says that once you've already made it night, you can't switch back and put on your tefillah and make it day. The Alter Rebbe, in the same Simon Lamed, says that he first quotes the first opinion. He says one who forgot to put on tefillin the whole day and realized after Ma'ariv, and but still before nightfall, before Shkia. So he says there are those who say you cannot put on tefillin because once you've made it nacht, and then I'm not sure why he adds in the brackets zman shchivo. You say Shema. So it's called night. It says sleeping time because Shema said b'shach b'cho and tefillah shel arvis. I'm not sure what the background for that whole bracket is. But he says once you've made it night, how can you put on tefillin and call it day again? So it's contradictory. But then the last line, the Alter Rebbe adds, "V'yesh mi shechoylek al zeh, v'toiv lochush l'svoro ha'acharon." Now, those who disagree with the Trumas Hadeshen, and they say, even though you personally have made it night, Lailo, that means that that's your own behavior that hasn't changed it into Lailo objectively, and then you can still and you should still put on tefillin. In the Kuntras Achron, the Alter Rebbe gives a reference there to the Schach in Simon Kuf Tzadik Vov, who deals with a hefsek tara. If a person has started Shabbos earlier, doing a hefsek tara afterwards, so normally one would do before, but if it was afterwards, you can still do it because, in other words, although you have cosmetically, should we call it Lailo, but it doesn't change it objectively. It is still Yom, it's still day, and you can do the mitzvahs which are associated with the day. I have sources, and I've written about this in the Sivim, in Bestei Ashlichas Chelik Beis, addressing this point of this Hashal with the Tefillin about not saying a brocha. Because once you've made it Lailo, okay, Trumas Hadeshen says you cannot. So I guess because of that, we have a bit of a suffix. So coming back to the Lulav, you've been Mekabel Shabbos, or you've been Kabel Shmini Atzeres, and you haven't benched Lulav, so do bench Lulav, but don't make a brocha. And the reason being that, according to some poskim, once you've made it nacht, you can't make it back into day again, so it shouldn't be too cool. I'm not sure how you read it. I think it's shtei koilos, Shostosa says, like two voices. 1 minute you said Ma'ariv, and now you're coming back and saying brocha, which is saying it's yoim, and those voices shouldn't be there. So, all right, so you do the mitzvah, but we don't say a brocha. Let's go on to the next question. Interesting question. Someone came over to me one day during Chol HaMoed in shul, and he says we were up to a musaf around there, or perhaps even afterwards. He says, I just realized he rushed out of the house. Now, Minhag Chabad is to bench Lulav in the morning, at home, in your sukkah at home, and then to come to shul, and you use the Lulav for Hallel and for Hoshanos. So he had rushed out of the house with his Lulav in hand, Lulav and Esrog, in the box. But then he used it for Hallel and Hoshanos, and then he realized, oops, I didn't make a brocha. So can he make a brocha now? This is his question. So here we have in Tofresh Nun Aleph, is the simon which talks about putting the Lulav together and the brocha on the Lulav. Unfortunately, the second part of that simon is not extant in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. So this part of the Shulchan Aruch is not we don't have the Alter Rebbe's position about this. So what you have here, the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Kotten Chavov says, if you forgot to make a brocha before picking up the Lulav and Esrog, you can still, they say, the brocha later, because so long as you're still going to sway it, you pick up the Lulav. So we know everyone has, we're familiar. We try to avoid this question about and brocha has to be overhanging before the mitzvah. So once you picked up the esrog, you've done the mitzvah. That's why people hold the esrog upside down. In Chabad, we hold the lulav and we say the brocha whilst the esrog is on the table, and then we pick up the esrog to avoid this question of overhanging. Shabbos is saying, but if you already picked up the esrog, but you haven't swayed it in various directions, then you can still make the brocha. There are those who say that if here you've got the lower down, you've got the nanuim ad halal, that's still also considered part of the mitzvah. They are that you can still say a brocha if you haven't done nanuim ad halal. The Kura Yaakov Ettlinger, he wants to say even the swaying the lulav at Hoshanos is also part of the mitzvah. So there are those who say that even though you've already picked up the lulav and the esrog, you already fulfilled the mitzvah, but still there's still extensions of the mitzvah which you haven't done yet. You can still make a bracha. But once the person has done everything, already gone through Hallel and gone through Hoshanos, so the mitzvahs, so he's done the mitzvahs of so then and he didn't make a bracha, you can't go back and make a bracha because you have completed the mitzvah. And bracha is einon me'akvos. I once had a case. I was by a pidyon haben, and the father standing next to the kohen, he put the coins in the kohen's hand, and then he hasn't said a bracha yet. Can you take the money back and put it back in the kohen's hands? You know that's the same problem. That once the mitzvah is completed, you can't go back and say a bracha. That's how the Rambam holds. There are those who disagree. There's a Or Zarua who says you can make a bracha after the act. Or Zarua and Simon Chof Hey. But the psak which I see from the Alter Rebbe, etc., is like the Rambam, that a bracha has to be overhanging, and once the act of the mitzvah has been done, you can't now say a bracha. Right. Let's now move on to a question which came up a couple of years ago, but it came up again now. When making Kiddush on what's called Chamar Medina, the local equivalent of wine, let's say you're making Kiddush on beer or vodka or whiskey or a cup of coffee. I've mentioned this before. There was, I think it was Rabbi Zirkin Alav Shalom, who was sent to Vietnam or Korea somewhere in the 1950 approximately, and the Rebbe told him that he should make Havdalah on a cup of coffee. So coffee is also called a Chamar Medina. Fine. So the question here is, do you say Leisha Basuka at Kiddush or at HaMoed? So let's explain the question. In the way it appears in Shulchan Aruch, is at night you'd say Leisha Basuka with the brocha right after Kiddush, but by day you'd say Leisha Basuka on the bread. However, Minhag Chabad is that we say the brocha Leisha Basuka together with the brocha of the wine by Kiddush, by the Kiddush of daytime too. Now the question is, okay, so Kiddush by day, you're making Leisha Basuka at Kiddush. Is that because of the wine, or is it because of the privilege of Kiddush? What's the factor here? So here you have in front of you two Rishimis of the Rebbe. One is from the year Tofrei Tzadik Aleph, which would be 1930, and the second one, the lower one, is from Tzadik Gimel, which is 1932. So in 1930, Tzadik Aleph, the Rebbe writes, I made Havdalah on wine. And Tzivani, my father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, told me to say Leishav Sukkah at $50. In the bracket he adds, but there was also, when we made Leishav Sukkah at $50, there was the intention to presently eat Sudas, the evening meal in the Sukkah. Therefore, it wasn't only for the $50, it was also in anticipation of the evening meal in the Sukkah. I'm going to go to the lower quote from Tov Tzadik Gimel. I made Havdalah in the Sukkah, writes there. And I asked, what about saying Leishav Sukkah? Which I'm curious why he asked a second time. Because if we've already been told in Tzadik Aleph that you'd make a Leishav Sukkah, why asked again? At any rate, I made Havdalah in the Sukkah, and I asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, yes, to say brocho or not. To which he answered, Al Dvar Kiddush, in reference to Kiddush, saying Leishav Sukkah, we heard explicitly from this father, from the Rebbe Rashab, to say Leishav Sukkah at Kiddush. First time it was in the year Tov Reish Nun Tes, the second day of Sukkah, said by Sukkah, and it has something which I not fully understand what he's talking about. Well, he referred to something which happened then. I don't know. Yes, misgiven, I'm not sure. And then he says, Havdalah, Frierdiker Rebbe says, since you're making Havdalah on wine, and we're going to eat the meal subsequently, food which is, so he replies, Leishav Sukkah, therefore you should say to keep it quiet. Interesting. So you have here making Leishav Sukkah at Havdalah is not so glad. It's in combination to the fact that you're going to eat supper of Lulav Malka presently, and even that he seems to be saying, don't make a pirsum. Okay, that's interesting, because until the Rishimus came out, this was not in Minhagei Chabad. You look at Sefer HaMinhagim, there is no mention of saying Leishav Sukkah at Havdalah, possibly because of the Aval B'Chashoy. Now, coming back to the first quote, so now he writes, in the year, in Atvotsk, in the year Tzadik Zion, this is in 1936, this time he made Havdalah on beer, and the Rebbe told me not to say Leishav Sukkah. So meanwhile, what we're seeing is Havdalah, even though you're going to have a meal soon, but not to say Leishav Sukkah unless it's wine, and there's a meal coming up. By contrast with the Kiddush, he just says what you make him have the Leishav Sukkah at Kiddush, does not differentiate whether it's wine or not. And if you're going to ask what's the difference between a Kiddush and Havdalah, the answer is very simple, that Havdalah does not necessitate a meal thereafter. It's a standalone. Kiddush has to be more Suda, is associated with a meal. And therefore, the follow-on of the meal is kind of intrinsic to Kiddush. And therefore, Leishav Sukkah, it's kind of leading into the meal. And therefore, you'd make Leishav Sukkah at Kiddush, even if it is, I believe, even if it is Hamar Medina. Last week, we had a discussion about whether to make Leishav Sukkah for the other members of the family. Should they make Leishav Sukkah separately later? And a lot of people come back to me and said, indeed, that's what they have been doing in their families, that the women or other members of the family who are not making Kiddush will make their own Leishav Sukkah. So I mean, I'm happy to accept that as your personal family minhag. I wouldn't label it as the Chabad minhag. And what I'm hearing, though, is from families of Talmidei Chachomim that they would make a point that if the women are making Leishav Sukkah, one woman writes to me that she's saying, going back 50, 60 years ago, that the sukkahs used to be much smaller. People couldn't necessarily, people lived in smaller dwellings and didn't have the big sukkahs. And it was very rare for women to join the men in the sukkah. And so what the women would typically be coming into the sukkah, and they would want to at least then make a brocha leishav sukkah. They want to have the privilege of making the brocha, but then they would make a point of dafka sitting down and having a shiur, and the shiur, as I mentioned last week, is a bit more than the volume of the of an egg, and then they would go back into the house. All right, let's go on. So just to summarize that, I believe that even if you're making Kiddush not on wine but on Chamar Medina, you'd also say Leishev Basuka at Kiddush, because Kiddush itself is kind of lending itself to a Kvias, because it is connected to the meal which follows on. Let's move on. Okay, so I'd written an article in the local Jewish Tribune, and one of the readers sent me the question. I was explaining the difference between, we're talking about Dofen Akumah, and when you have we're talking about a case of a person in a very narrow balcony, just about the size for a sukkah, but then you had a jutting out gutter. So there's this balcony, which let's say is 8 tefochim wide, but there's a gutter which is jutting out jutting out 2 tefochim, 3 tefochim. So is the sukkah kosher? So the answer is the sukkah is kosher, and according to most poskim, you're allowed to even sit under the gutter. So now he's asking, okay, so if I've got a protrusion from the wall of 3 tefochim on the side of the sukkah, I'm allowed to sit under it. If I have a protrusion which is 3 amas, so we have what we call the concept of Dofen Akumah, but we say you're not allowed to sit under it. You're not Yotzei Sukkah if you sit under the Dofen Akumah. So he's asking, what about the first 3 tefochim? If 3 tefochim of the gutter you get away with, you can sit under it. What about the first 3 tefochim of a larger stretch? Do you have the same concession? And obviously we never heard of such a thing. And so what's the reason? Why is there a concession for 3 tefochim of a gutter and not the first 3 tefochim of a larger extension? The answer is very simple, and you can see here the lashon of the Aruch HaShulchan, which says, what's the word of less than 3 tefochim? It's because it's not choshev. Because it's not choshev, it's negligible. But once it's a larger stretch, so then it does become mokum choshev, and therefore the entire stretch, even the first tefach of that stretch, is considered not sukkah. So again, if it's just a couple of tefochim, because it's so minimal, it's negligible. But once it's part of a larger stretch, so then it's a mokum choshev, which isn't sukkah, and you're not allowed to sit under it to be mekayim mitzvah sukkah. Okay, here's another very interesting question. Someone asked me, sukkah, let's say you've got 2 sukkahs, one on the upper floor and one on the lower floor, balconies, and I've mentioned this before, these mats are very good for picking up wind. And so the wind picked up the mat from Reuven's upstairs sukkah and lifted it, and it landed squarely on Shimon's sukkah on the lower floor. So now Shimon's sukkah is covered with Schach, which was heaven sent. Now, we're not dealing with an argument between Rov and Shimon, but Shimon's sukkah has now been covered with Schach, which was not placed there l'shem Schach. It wasn't placed there it wasn't placed there manually. It was placed there automatically. And every young boy who's learned the Mishnah knows that if you've carved out a niche in a haystack, that is not a valid sukkah, because the coverage wasn't placed there l'shem sukkah. And we've got many halochos that the coverage of the sukkah has to be placed l'shem sale. I want to show you the following quote from the Alter Rebbe. Let's read inside the Tafresh Chavov Sif Aleph. You only yoitzu with a sukkah she'asuya ein asuya elo l'tseil. The sukkah has to be made exclusively for shade. Bilvad. Over sukkahs, I read that there's a sikha of the Rebbe in Parshas Emor in Tafshin in Chelik Lamed Beis discusses this at length, the difference. The Alter Rebbe adds some words here which are not in the earlier sources. The emphasis has to be for shade. Dugmas anane hakovet. Avalimi asuya gam ledira. If the sukkah is made also for permanent dwelling, not just for shade, if the sukkah is made, the schach, if it's made for tasmashal snius, it's made for, if the word is privacy, storage, other uses, other than shade. Or if the sukkah is made to protect from zerem or motor, if it's made to protect from rain. Kol she'eina asuya letzeil bilvad, if the schach was not just for shade, ein zoi sukkah elabayis, it's not valid because it's not a sukkah. Sukkah is just for shade. And I was very surprised to realize that for years I'd been thinking that, it's min Chabad to put lots of schach. And here you have a quote from Reb Zalman Duchman's book, L'Shem Oizen. Reb Isaac Hommel, Chassid of the Alter Rebbe, and he was piling up the schach more and more. And people asked him, but you have to be able to see the stars. So he says, when he was in Liozna, he saw the Alter Rebbe saying, noch gedichte, put up more schach, thicker and thicker. And the story also is that they asked her, what about the stars? So you poke a stick through the schach and you'll see the stars. So for years I've been thinking that the reason why they indulge in this excess amount of schach was because in the freezing cold, it would protect the sukkah from being freezing. But now I'm realizing if that was the motive, that is actually raising a question on the validity of the sukkah. The sukkah must be just for shade, not for any other purpose. If it's there for another form of protection, as you see here, if it's for privacy, if it's for protection from rain, etc., it's not valid. So there are, in the Dirshu edition, other Achronim pick up on this Shlosh on the Alter Rebbe, very strong emphasis that the sukkah has to be just for shade. So I don't know. So coming back, meanwhile, why does the Alter Rebbe say to put up so much schach? And I don't know the answer to that. So let's finish off this point. Let's come back. So this question of the schach, which was airborne and landed on Shimon's sukkah, it wasn't placed there l'shem tzel. It wasn't placed for shade. In Simon Tov Reish Lamed Beis, I think, sukkah's ganvach. If a goy built a sukkah out in the countryside for a shade, that's kosher. But if it wasn't built l'shem shade, then it's not kosher. So this is the question. You now got Shimon's sukkah, which has been covered with a double layer, the upper layer being made not l'shem shade. Is that sukkah kosher? So this question was put to Rav Vosner, Rav Shevet HaLevi, and this is Chelik Yud, Simon Kuf, I believe, and he concludes that the sukkah is kosher because the schach intrinsically is kosher schach, but he adds another very important point, which I saw him quoted without this important point. People quote things from Sforim, and they think they're doing us a favor by making it brief. Very important detail he adds, that the schach hatachtoin is the roiv, and therefore there's a majority between the two layers of schach. He's assuming, or he knows that case, that the airborne schach is the minority and the lower layer is the majority. So all right, on that basis, he says it's okay. And again, he says, only if there's nothing you can do to rectify it, then okay. Which I would say that if you could get, even on Shabbos, if you get onto the roof of onto the schach and shove off the extra layer, kilachayad, call it muksa, so move it kilachayad. I would say you should do that, because it is presenting a problem. He's saying you can ignore it because it's a minority, but otherwise he does have a problem with it. I've said this about this people misquoting things in reference to someone has just sent me a chat that the Frierdiker that the Nite Gavriel brings that the Frierdiker Rebbe said to make Leshav Sukkah on Havdalah, at Havdalah, because it's called a Kvias. No mention about eating afterwards. That's one have to have in mind that he's going to eat after Havdalah. My Mechutin always has Rizonis on the table for after Havdalah. Well, I think your Mechutin is right. Myself, I must admit, I wasn't sensitive to this. But you look at the source again. This Havdalah in the Sukkah is not mentioned in the Sefer HaMinhagim. It's in the Rishimis, which were, as we know, the Rebbe's diaries, which he wrote for himself. And in both of the places where it does say about making Leishav Sukkah Havdalah, it adds that there is the intention to eat shortly. Well, it doesn't say how long, but even if it's a couple of hours, up to a couple of hours after Havdalah. So that's part of the justification for saying Leishav Sukkah at Havdalah. But let's say if you are in one sukkah let's say you're making Havdalah in the sukkah at the shul, and then you're going to go home, then I guess you wouldn't say Leishav Sukkah even though you make Havdalah on wine. So by cutting out that detail, actually, you've missed something important. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay, let's move on. Right. So, no, we live and learn. And so for years, I've been saying that I have a problem with blackened arovas. And I think I mentioned last week that I picked up a sefer and learned that they are kosher. Okay, and black is a problem only for an esrog, but the other minim, if they're discolored, it doesn't matter. So someone heard the shiur and kindly sent me the following quote from the Radvaz.
Sorry, what? Yes.
Someone hasn't muted themselves. There we go. Okay. Problem solved. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. So now the Radvaz, Reb David ben Zamro, who was around the time of Reb Yosef Karo, perhaps a generation earlier. So he is both a halachist and a mekubal. He has a sefer on the mitzvahs called Mitzudas David Ta'amei HaMitzvahs. In Siman Kuf Yud Ches, or Mitzvah Kuf Yud Ches, he explores the Daled Minim with their significance al pi Kabbalah. And then he says that the Arova is being the least of the Daled Minim and the very lowly, and it's got to do with, I don't know whether he used the word Sitra Achra, but he really beats really smashes the Arova down. And he says that's the reason why we beat the Arova, and to weaken the power of the Sitra Achra, etc. It says in the Gemara, Chavoid v'loi baruch. Beat it, don't make a bracha. Then he adds, I have a custom not to change my arovas for the whole week. On the contrary, if it's shriveled, it's better. And for this reason, in particular, that the arovas should not stick out above the hadassah, because the idea is to lahamtik hadin, to sweeten the arovas as dinim, and we want to have the hados, which is chesed, to sweeten the dinim, which is the arova. And he quotes then a pasuk, so whilst we've been worried about blackened arovas, the Radvaz actually doesn't talk about, he's talking about shriveled. And he actually seems to say, well, if the arovas are shriveled, so be it. He's quite happy with that. The Shulchan Aruch, here we have a Tofrishnun Daled, against not the Alter Rebbe. There are more rights. It's customary to have every day of Chol HaMoed a new arova, and that's a Hiddur Mitzvah. In Sefer HaMinhagim, we have B'meshech Yimei Chol HaMoed, we switch the Hadassim and the arovas, some of them or all of them or some of them. In the footnote in the Sefer HaMinhagim, he refers us to the Shulchan Aruch over here, Tafresh Nun Daled.
covering the quote.
And he tells us to look up in the Tafresh Nun Dalet. Some disagree; they're not so happy about switching the arova every day. People stick them into the bunch and they rip off the leaves. But be that as it may, the idea of switching the arovas is something which we do go for. And I'm saying this now, and I hope people will remember by next year. I saw in Hoshana Rabbah several people with their lulovim, and the harovas looked very sorry. They look quite shriveled. And if you look at Otzim and Hagi Chabad, you'll see that we are particular, especially for Hoshana Rabbah, that the arovas should look fresh. And Baruch Hashem, the arovas are available all over. The arovas, the arovas should look fresh. And you see, contrary to the Radvaz, he has his view, but certainly the Ramod does not follow that, and Minich Chabad does not follow that. We do make a point of the arovas also being fresh. As I mentioned last time, sometimes people have got these arovas and most of the leaves are gone, which is possible. You can't make a brocho on it. It has to be the rov of the leaves, or the top three tefochim have to be there. If most of the leaves are gone, you remember Loshen, ole echad bevad echad, one leaf or one twig. That's what about Hoshanos. Ole echad bevad echad is good. For arovas, for the mitzvah of arov to make a brocho, it has to be rov of the top three tefochim have to be there. All right. So, I thank the person for this ha'ora from the Radvaz. Still remain that we should make sure that we have good conditioned arovas. One more thing I would like to say. I once wrote a whole article about David HaMelech. And the Gemara Sukkah talks about David HaMelech at the time they were digging out the shisin, the holes down deep in the ground by the Mizbeach, and there's a piece of earthenware, and he comes down for phenomenal depth, and there's a piece of earthenware, and says, and these earthenware, this Cheres says, don't pick me up. If you do, you'll cause the world to flood. And David HaMelech, as they say in Yiddish, Aftzalochas, he lifts up the piece of Cheres, and it starts flooding. And then it starts flooding, and then is worried that the world is going to start being flooded over, and Achitophel is overlooking the proceedings, and he's hoping that David will get drowned, and then he will become Melech instead. He was the grandfather of Shlomo HaMelech, by the way. And David says, whoever knows how to stop this and will not tell us how to stop the flood, he should be Nidui. And Achitophel is intimidated by that, and he says that you should if you could take Hashem's name and erase it in order to bring harmony between husband and wife. In the case of a sota, so too you should use Hashem's name to bring to quell the flooding. And my question was, why did David HaMelech? Come on, why did he have to lift up that thing? It says don't do it. And basically the answer, which I thought saw whatever, is that he's building a Beis HaMikdash. He wants the Beis HaMikdash to be able to atone even for the lowest element. And that's what this Cheres is saying. If you do this, it's going to be the end of the world, so to speak. And David HaMelech wants to show that even if a person has done a sin, which is the end of the world kind of affair, still he can get atonement. And these are the arovas. Let's say the arovas, yeah? But Hashem is called Soilul Roichev Arovas. Hashem rides on the arovas, which the Radvaz also quotes this. Hashem rides on the arovas. So there are these Poshta Yidden, and they may not know what they're doing properly, but they are very precious to Hashem. So instead of the attitude of the Radvaz, who's saying, let them be shriveled, actually we have a special chibur, and we want the arovas actually to be in good condition. I want to just finish off this point. There is an old Jewish joke book which somehow achieved the status of a sefer, and he says a quote: "Why do you beat the arova on Hoshana Rabbah? He's been in such good company for a whole week. He's been together with the esrog and the lulav and the hodos. and he remained the same garnished. He deserved to get off your pitch. That's why you beat the Arab. As I'm saying, I remember it's not a holy sefer, it's a joke book. To which I respond is, you can only take that attitude, yes or no, only if you're then going to pick up that Arava and put it on top of the Aron HaKodesh. If you are ready to chastise, but you're also ready to invest energy to propel that person who you're criticizing and knocking down, if you're going to pick them up to put them on top of Aron HaKodesh, okay, I can understand. But just to start beating without being ready to pick up, I don't think you're justified. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so here's a very interesting question. A woman's listening to Kiddush, and she's not eating in the sukkah. Got not enough space in the sukkah. Man makes Kiddush, and he makes the brocho Leishav sukkah. And she's now answering Omein. Is that Omein a hefsek? Because she doesn't need the brocho Leishav sukkah. So I saw, and this is from Sefer Shmis, Shabbos Halocho has got a lot of discussion about this. Some say that it is a problem, it's a hefsek, because she can drink the wine. I have a simple answer, let her make a broch on the wine herself, finish. But fine. Others say that if she does want to sit in the sukkah, so then it's not a hefsek. Then there is from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who says that if you're listening to Kiddush, even though you don't need that brocha of Leishav sukkah, and the case also about Shechianu, the woman said a Shechianu by Lichtzinen, she doesn't need the Shechianu, but you are listening to Kiddush, and for the person making Kiddush, those brachas are important, then you can answer Omen in any case. So even if a woman's not sitting in the sukkah, she can still answer Omen for Leishav sukkah. Certainly, if she is sitting in the sukkah, she can answer Omen on the Leishav sukkah, and Yotze with that if she wishes. If she wants, as I said a minute ago, she can avoid this shaila of being Yotze Kiddush, and the Hagofen, she'll make her own brocha Hagofen, and then there's no question of hefsek in any case. Right. Let's move on. So one of our listeners asked, so that's number 7. Wait a minute, that was number 6. Number 7, oh, that's about the blackened aravas. So I know what you've got in your sheet. I've added another question here, so the numbers may be slightly different. Okay, now we have here, one of our listeners asked about what's so special about the Peseach Es Yodecha pasuk. Isn't the pasuk before that, that Hashem provides food for all of us? Isn't that the same as Peseach Es Yodecha? Why are we making such a fuss about the pasuk Peseach Es Yodecha? So, all right. So the fuss is in the Gemara Brochus. You can see on the left of the screen. Says Rebbe Lozer in the name of Rebbe Avino, whoever says Tehillah LeDavid 3 times a day, he is assured that he's a Ben Olam Haba. Why is that? If it's because it's got the Aleph base. So what about Ashrei Tvi Medorach, Kuf Yotes? It's got Aleph base times 8. It's even, and the answer is because it has Peseach Es Yodecha. But then if it's a Peseach Es Yodecha, but then Hallel Agodl, Kapitel Kuf Lamed Vav, it also has Noisel Lechem Nochal Basar. So what's the difference? Why Dafka? Why it's so special about Ashrei? The answer is because it's got both. It's got the whole Aleph base, and it's got Peseach Es Yodecha. All right, so what's so special about the Peseach? You noticed I've emphasized the final letters of the 3 words Peseach Es Yodecha, and they are the word Chatach, which means a slice. The mem is not missing in Ashrei, it's the nun is missing in Ashrei. The Gemara discusses that. So what's this slice? You see this is also Chalifosi to Morosi Kaparosi, is also the Rosh Hashanah Chatach, and that relates to what we say Hachoisich Chaim L'chol Chai. The word Chatach means a portion. I explained to the Talmidos, that the life and Parnosa is not a smorgasbord, it's not a buffet. A buffet you can go over with a dish and take as much as you want. Parnosa and Bonne Chaim Mezoine is all a package. You go on the plane, they bring you a package. This is your package of food. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Eibishter designates a package for each one of us. That's the chatach, and we're asking that it should be a should be a good portion. So that's now here you have on the screen. We've got here from the Ben Ish who wrote a sefer on the Agadah, the Gemara, and he talks about this piece of Gemara, and he says, all right, Pesach Yodecha has got the Shem of Parnosa, which is Chatach. It also has, in addition to Pesach Yodecha, which has the Sofer Teva as Chatach, but also the word Umasbia. So Shin is 300, Mem and Yud is 50, that's 350. Ayin is 70, that brings us to 420. And then Vov and Beis is 8, 428. So Tov Chov Ches. So Umasbia is also the same as Chatach. So we have in the Pasuk Pesach Yodecha Umasbia, we've got the remez to Chatach twice. And he says also in the words Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor. Now you look at the Gemara over here. Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor. So you have Noisein is a Tov in the middle, Lechem is a Ches in the middle, and L'chol is a Chof in the middle. So you got the remez for this group of letters Chatach is also Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor. So he's giving us a deeper understanding, on the remez level in the Gemara. Why don't we? Why Pesach Yodecha? Why not Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor? You want to have a remez for Chatach, well, Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor. You also have a remez to the letters of Chatach. To which he answers, which is not pshutai of the Gemara. He says, "Is betarti that in Pesach Yodecha Masbia you've got Chatach twice, whereas in Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor you only have it once." So that's how he learns pshat in the Gemara of this the advantage of Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor of Pesach Yodecha over Noisein Lechem L'chol Bosor. It's got the remez to Chatach twice. Fine. Before we leave this point, the Rosh Hashanah of Pesach Yodecha is Pei Aleph Yud, which is 91, which I think is 65 and 26. Does that make sense? 65 and 26. 80, yeah. 5 and yeah, says 80 is 91. So Omein, it's also Omein, it's also the same gematria, which is the two shemas of Havaya and Adni. So you have that also in the Pesach Yodecha. What I'm seeing now though, in the Alter Rebbe's Siddur, which I'm sorry I didn't put on the screen, the words Pesach Yodecha have got inverted segels. There's 6 inverted segels, 3 on the beginning of the 3 words, and 3 on the end of the 3 words. There's no emphasis on the Umasbia, whereas here the Ben Ish Chai is showing the remez also in the word Umasbia, which is not alluded. So in other words, in the Alter Rebbe's Siddur, much as he tried to avoid any Kabbalistic stuff, but there are a few places here and there which have got little remozim, and Pesach Yodecha is one of those which has got the remez to the Rosh Hashanah and the Sofer Teva of Pei Aleph Yud and Chatach. Okay, someone called me today and asked me to address in the shiur, so I'm going to close this. I've got two points left which I want to address. One is that I mentioned before about the feedback about women eating in the sukkah, how it used to be back in the day. Also last week, I mentioned about if the pitum fell off the esrig, and it's not so posh that it's possible. There are circumstances where you'd be even allowed to make a brocho. So this woman tells me that one year the pitum fell off the Rebbe's esrig, which was being used by the kehillah, one after the other, and immediately they brought the Rebbetzins esrig instead, and they continued with the Rebbetzins esrig. I want to just say what I remember hearing about this, that whoever it was went into the Rebbe, and who It was an elderly person who had dropped the esrog, and the person came in to the Rebbe, whoever was Rabbi Harlik, whoever, and said the esrog became possible. And so the Rebbe said, I don't want to hear who it was. Don't tell me who it was. The Rebbe stopped him from saying who was the man who dropped it. He wasn't interested. He didn't want the person to feel, uncomfortable. And they brought in another esrog. So of course, l'chatchila, if you're using esrog with a pitum, you want to have the pitum there. If you didn't have another esrog, and well, whatever, you had another esrog which is of poor quality, and this esrog has no pitum, then there's room to make a brocho on it, even as I mentioned, Alter Rebbe Shulchan. Finally, since we're finishing off with about esrog, and that is, someone asked me what to do with an esrog from Eretz Yisrael. Many of us have used esrogim from Calabria, but there are those who do have esrogim from Eretz Yisrael. What are you meant to do with the esrog? Because it does have Kiddush Shvius. It's, if it was picked from the esrog tree before Rosh Hashanah, it has a status of Shemitah, and you have to treat it with Kiddush Shvius. So what are you meant to do with the esrog? Now, you may have heard of some people sending them back. I don't know whether there is a established service on sending esrogim back to Israel. I haven't heard of such a service. Really, though, that seems to be an extra hidur. There is a din of, what I want to do spell out, is la'ochlo v'loy lehefsid. That shemitah produce is la'ochlo v'loy lehefsid, to be eaten, not to be wasted, not to be ruined. So to take an esrog, which is edible, and to put it in the garbage is not allowed if it's esrog from shemitah. What I do see is that it's recommended that you should take the esrog and make it into into jam or something, make it edible, and it should be eaten before Chodesh Shvat. There is a concept called Zman Habir, the fruit of shemitah. Once that fruit is no longer available in the wild, we are not allowed to retain it in our private possession. So, if it's no longer available in the wild, then you shouldn't be holding it on at home. That time when that particular product, that produce is not available in the wild, that's called Zman Habir. And what I've got here in front of me, here a sefer called Dinei Shvius, which was picked up, so I had it from Tosh Mem Zayin, and that's what he's advising here, that before Chodesh Shvat, which is apparently the Zman Habir when esrogim are no longer available in the wild, which I don't really understand, because they stay in the tree for the whole time, but that's what they're saying. So you should make it into food and eat it. If you're doing that, whatever you're not going to eat, peels or whatever which you're not going to eat, they should be kept in a bag until they go moldy. And once they've gone moldy, then you're allowed to discard them. So again, you can perhaps recommend it to make the esrog into a food and eat it before Shvat, and whatever parts are not going to be eaten, like peels, etc., be kept until they become inedible. At that point, you are allowed to dispose of them, as you normally dispose of waste. All right, that's what I can suggest for you for now, and I wish you all good evening.
Raskin,
let me just yes, Dov, yeah.
I asked this question about the sending it back. All the people who sell the esrogim from Israel have a service that they will take it back after Sukkos and they send it back. It's
wonderful. Oh, thank you for that. So, all right. So now we know that you can send it back. And I guess there's going to be a big industry of making esrog jam in Eretz Yisrael from all of this esrogim. Wonderful. And they have to be eaten before Shvat. Right. I just want to say that next week we'll, Bez Hashem, have the same time. But the following week already, after the time change, we'll switch to the Motzei Shabbos slot. And I'm thinking of doing it earlier in the evening. Rather than waiting till 8:30, I'd like to do it more like 7:30 p.m., which will then allow the later part of the evening to participate in Malav Malkus, etc. It's Shnas Hakhil. Baruch Hashem, this shiur has developed because of COVID but as one of our guests over Yom Tov explained, Hachil is the answer to COVID. COVID means everyone's isolated and insulated in their own homes, and Hachil is when people get together. So, Bez Hashem, like to make it that we can have the shiur and still be able to participate in communal events for Motzei Shabbos. So I wish you a good Shabbos and fine Shabbos Breishis and alle gute Sachen. Kol tov.